Over the years, I've had a number of clients, students, friends and colleagues, and even people who've just reached out to me who were troubled by buying into some sort of philosophical point of view or position or claim or assertion that they didn't need to necessarily do that with. And then, being quite upset or making bad decisions on the basis of thinking that that was true, and not just true, but unassailably true, or true in a sense that they had to follow it. And you might say, well, that's very abstract. What are you talking about here? Let me give you one prime example. So I had a philosophical counseling client who came to me because they were very worried about the non-existence of free will and what the implications of that were for their own life. And, maybe others have gone through this who are watching this. In this guy's case, he had been, listening to a lot of podcasts, and I won't actually name the person who had made these sweeping assertions on the basis of neuroscience that there was no such thing as free will. But this person bought it, and they were very troubled about the implications of it. And I, ignored the easy, low-hanging fruit of saying, well, I guess you're just determined to be bothered by that, and I'm equally determined to try to see if I can help you out with that. I didn't take that sort of tack. Instead, I asked one central question, which we're going to reiterate at the end. How in the hell do you know that person is actually right? And how would they possibly know that there is no such thing, with such a degree of certitude that they can make this absolutely unequivocal, apodictic, sweeping assertion for all of us? Now, what I advocate is not just throwing everything out, but a healthy skepticism about these sorts of very big philosophical claims about whatever you want it to be, the existence or the non-existence of God, whether there is free will or not. And by free will, people mean a million different things, right? So you always got to clarify, are there different, fundamentally different mentalities in men and women, or in conservatives and liberals, or pick whatever else you want. People make these really, really broad claims quite frequently, and it's not something radically new. This has been going on for millennia, but I think that it's a more pressing problem now in our internet, whatever you want to call it, infused, infected age, in which you have the possibility of getting all sorts of people's ideas essentially thrown at you en masse with links to everything else so easily. So, what is common to these kinds of claims? Let's think about that first. I actually, as I was considering this, I came up with 4 main characteristics that, and this might be helpful for you to, think about whether you or somebody else that is buying into these sorts of ideas. So one is that these claims wind up being made at a very high level of generality. Oftentimes they're framed in universal terms: everybody, nobody, all humans of this sort, all humans of this sort. There's a kind of totalizing of the universe that goes on with this. So we're talking about really, really big stuff and big claims that goes along with that. And, another thing is that these are claims and positions that are made about matters that for, a long time have been the province of philosophy. Not exclusively so. Like, does life have meaning or not? Well, philosophy has a lot to say about that. So does literature, so does history, so do other, important arts, sciences, whatever you want to call them, disciplines, we could say. Whether, all things are determined causally, or whether there are, some scope for human freedom and a faculty that we call the will, that's, a matter of psychology. That can be a matter of other things as well, but that's definitely within the province of philosophy. So when we start to see people talking about these really big ideas, we should be a little bit suspicious, especially if they try to make claims like, philosophers have argued about this for hundreds of years and never made any progress. That's a philosophical claim, by the way, philosophical claim. And, we're going to solve it with this instead. People have been doing that for hundreds of years, quite frankly. We'll do another video about that some other time. So those are two characteristics. The third is that what we see people doing typically is oversimplifying. A lot of people love dichotomies, some people are like this and other people are like this, or some thinking is slow and some thinking is fast, or, and they throw these things out there as if it's that simple. Typically it's not. And we should be a little bit leery of anybody who is using a lot of oversimplifications, typically drawn from other people. I suppose it's worse when all the oversimplifications are coming from their own weird, quirky theory, but we should be, on our guard when we see people making claims where the parts are very, very clear and distinct, and, they probably don't have that real nature. And then the other part is that these claims tend to be asserted, I was at first tempted to say with a high level of confidence, but we don't actually know what's in the other person's mind. It could be that they actually don't really believe it, but they're asserting it so that they can get, followers or clout or money or something like that, build themselves a name. Certainly they're giving the appearance of being very confident about what it is that they're saying. So we see people coming on and saying, there's obviously no such thing as free will. And you're like, whoa, how do you actually know that to such a degree of not just confidence, but absolute certainty as to enunciate it like that? So these four different claims or four different characteristics of claims. That might be helpful for you in thinking about it. What are the kinds of claims that people are making, or where are these claims coming from? So a big thing is like pop psychology, what we mean by popular psychology, where people have got some ideas they're taking from some psychological theory, or it could be evolutionary biology, or it could be neuroscience. Always be on guard when somebody makes claims about neuroscience, because some neuroscience is really science and some of it is absolute junk, and there's everything in between. Don't take it take it on confidence that somebody invoking these things automatically knows what they're doing. So popularizations of scientific matters coming perhaps from the natural sciences or the social sciences, or from other fields as well. We see people doing bad history of ideas, quite often relying on some sketchy sources that had axes to grind, and then coming out with a whole book about that sort of thing. So that's one origin of these sorts of claims. Scientists who stray outside of their fields, outside of their disciplines, outside of where their training was, outside of their areas of competence. Very common, right? If you see somebody who's a great scientist claim that philosophy is dead, they're full of crap at that point, because they don't actually know. Usually they haven't done the requisite study or reading, and they're just opining. It's sort of like listening to a plumber wanting to, tell us about which symphonies are the best. I mean, if they're actually a trained musician or they've done music history, now we're not listening to them as a plumber, we're listening to them as that. But that's not usually the case. A third one, I mentioned bad history of ideas. There's a lot of people out there peddling, very schematized readings on the history, the very complicated history of ideas, a lot of bad histories of philosophy out there, sometimes coinciding with the pop psychology sort of stuff. And you don't want to take that stuff just on the credit that the person has written a book. Anybody can write a book. These days, anybody can publish a book. Amazon self-publishing. You can also find lots of really mediocre, poorly researched stuff coming out from reputable presses that maybe shouldn't be so reputable anymore. You actually have to look closely at what the person is saying. And then finally, the last thing that I want to mention in here, and this may seem like a bit of an outlier, but I think it really can be helpful in this respect. When philosophers, big name philosophers, give a take on some other philosopher or a philosophical school or movement or something like that, it's not always right. Prime example of this, somebody who I do a lot of work on, Hegel, right? Hegel's a very interesting author. He's got this interesting systematic approach to not only the mind, but history and all sorts of cool stuff. But he's not a good historian of ideas. Sometimes he's insightful, but a lot of times he gets stuff wrong, And we can say similar things. People bring up, for example, Nietzsche's takedown or critique of Stoicism in Beyond Good and Evil. Well, Nietzsche could be wrong. How do you know that because this guy over here said something that this over here is no good, valueless, right? You don't actually until you go and you study the object of critique. Similarly, we could say, we're talking about a lot of German philosophers here. Arthur Schopenhauer says some really stupid things about Hegel, and should you let Schopenhauer's dismissal of Hegel as a charlatan dissuade you from actually studying Hegel or taking him seriously? You'd be kind of a fool to do so, wouldn't you? Without actually checking up on whether Schopenhauer's critique is actually correct. Now, why does this matter? So, we should care about actually getting things right, not endorsing and reproducing and disseminating false ideas. That's important for us as human beings, as truth-seeking creatures, right? So, we should call out falsity and deception and lying and sloppy scholarship and stuff like that. But there's some other really important reasons going beyond this. The first of which is, as I pointed out, I actually do encounter people and talk with them about this issue. Sometimes people will, see a claim being made and they will believe it. And then they'll be like, holy crap, this changes everything for me. If there is no free will, then what happens? How should I look at moral responsibility? What about my own actions? Am I just merely an automaton? And this causes a lot of people trouble, anguish, anxiety, anger, all sorts of negative affects and emotions. So if you don't want to have those caused by the ideas, it might be helpful to look whether the ideas are actually grounded in anything, whether these claims have any genuine basis to back them up, or whether it's mere assertion. Sometimes people make decisions or judgments based on these sweeping, ultimately, they could be true, but probably are false sorts of claims. And wow, like if you're going to run your relationship life based on what some guru who happens to have a podcast is telling you and you're uncritically accepting it, you might screw your life up. And so that's a significant problem. Another thing is, there's something weird about giving people, as we say, brain space or room in your mind rent-free. You wouldn't just take in anybody as a roommate, would you? You check them out first, don't you? You do like an internet search and maybe even a background check. Well, why would you do that for somebody who's written a book or has a podcast or, is putting ideas out there in some other way? Why wouldn't you verify whether they're actually right before you give them some of your valuable real estate in your mind? And then, the other thing that I'll mention, and again, this is in part, it's not a product of the internet age, but it's exacerbated a little bit with the internet age. You can easily find communities of true believers who buy whatever it is that this person has to say, and they will be like a reinforcing feedback loop that you don't want to get caught in because they're buying that BS. It doesn't mean that you have to, but if you want to hang out with them, if you want them to be part of your life and them to be part of yours, you kind of have to drink their Kool-Aid in order to do that. And what if you start finding a bad taste in your mouth when drinking that Kool-Aid? Just drink some more and it'll work out. That's a sign that you're not really in a community of free thinkers or anything. You're in something like a cult. So, these are all some important considerations. Now, what practical advice do I actually have? I've done a lot of charting out what the problem is. I think that we should evince some healthy skepticism. I don't mean the kind of skepticism that says, I can't know anything, I distrust everybody. No hyperbolic, silly skepticism. Even Descartes says that's just a method, that's not where you want to keep on living, right? But healthy skepticism, saying, well, how do we know this? What's the actual basis for this? So, when it comes to claims that you think you're stuck with because you heard somebody else telling you them or you read them somewhere, ask yourself, well, how do I know that this is actually the case? And that'll be very helpful for you. That's a habit that you should get into. You don't have to do it in a combative way. You don't have to be like, you got to prove it to me, man. You can just be like, I want to, have some good grounds for accepting very general statements that I might use to actually run my life and make decisions and structure the work that I'm going to do and understand my relationships. But you can also turn that on these people and you can say, how would they possibly know these things that they're saying? If somebody wants to make a claim that there is, once again with the free will, there is no free will whatsoever in the universe, definitely not with human beings, this has been proven, you can say, well, how in the hell would you know that? Have you actually peered into the head of every single human being throughout history, all the billions of people on our planet? Have you done that sort of work? No, you looked in a few MRI machine things and you did a few experiments? Oh, that's interesting. So you didn't really accumulate the kind of data that would justify a sweeping claim like this, right? If people want to make really wide-ranging claims, they got to have really, really good evidence that addresses every single possible loophole before you can buy it. I mean, if they want to hedge their bets and say, well, probably, or it's likely that, now those are weaker claims, right? And they don't have to have quite as much to justify that, but they still have to be able to justify it. They still have to be able to say where they got this privileged viewpoint that we all should buy into. So skepticism towards them. I think it's also very important to take account of your own experience and to experiment with ideas in life. And that's not to say that, personal experience trumps everything, but it does count for something, right? And this extends not just to experiencing things in the world, but your experience of reading and thinking. You are a rational being just as much as any pop, culture person out there who's got 1 million followers is. They're not more rational than you. So, you can use your faculties to think these things through, and you have the right to say, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to buy that right now. That's an interesting hypothesis you're proposing, but I don't see enough there to compel me. You should be skeptical about these kinds of arguments. You have the freedom to do this. And I'm going to teach you something from the ancient skeptics. They talked about for every argument, for every claim with evidence being provided, you could oppose to it another argument. And this is not just a game. This is not just to knock things down. It's to buy you a certain space of freedom to think these things through. Skeptikoi means seekers, those who are actually looking for what would be true. The last thing I'll say is, the world and human nature, incredibly complex, right? So anybody who wants to say that these things are simple and straightforward, that should probably be a red flag to you right off the bat. We need to continually keep thinking and learning and discerning and judging and sometimes, saying, oh, I made a wrong turn, I need to come back over here. That's the way that things work for truly rational beings, as rational as we can be. So if you're the kind of person who does have a tendency to buy into these bombastic claims that typically get made within the field of philosophy, sometimes by philosophers, sometimes by other people, maybe this is helpful for you. Maybe there's some interesting examples that you'd like to bring up or discuss in the comments. And I hope that, if it hasn't been helpful, at least is thought-provoking and interesting for you.